09. The crack of my daughter's palm against my cheek was a sound I had never heard in my 72 years yet. It felt rehearsed, a dreadful practice. Silence fell over the gilded patio, thick enough to muffle the distant string quartet. My son Julian, his face a mask of strained neutrality, brought his hands together once, a single hollow clap that echoed louder than the slap itself, and Beatrice, my daughter-in-law, the architect of this exquisite evening, merely smirked. It was not a smile of triumph, but of confirmation, as if a difficult but necessary scene in a play had finally been executed in that frozen moment. I did not cry. I did not utter a single word. I simply turned and walked away from the banquet they insisted was in my honor for 3 years. I wrapped myself in that same silence, a cloak I hoped would make them miss me, make them remember the woman I once was to them. But they did not. Instead, they came to me with a contract, a sheaf of papers designed to erase me with a fountain pen. But as they pushed it across my antique mahogany desk, I remembered something else, a voice from the past. A whispered promise, and a small, heavy box they had long forgotten I possessed that night, the solitary glow of a lamp in the home I built. I finally unlocked the future they never ever saw coming. The envelope was cream-heavy and impossibly thick for a simple invitation. My name, Alara, was written in a silver swirling script across the front. Not Mom, not Mother, just Alara. I sat at the head of the long dining table, the early morning light from the bay window catching the fine porcelain curve of my teacup. The house was hushed, imbued with the profound stillness that settles into a home after the lives you nurtured have grown up and moved on, leaving only echoes behind inside the envelope. A glossy cardstock bloomed with floral flourishes and embossed lettering, an evening to honor our matriarch, a celebration of legacy and love. It was signed by Beatrice, my daughter-in-law. The signature not handwritten but printed in a font chosen to look personal. I held the card, its weight a lie, in my hand, and stared at the words until they blurred into an elegant smudge. I hadn't heard Beatrice's voice in 3 years. Not since the week following my husband Arthur's funeral, when she had my belongings moved from the master suite to the guest room overlooking the wilting rose bushes. It was done. She had explained to give me a fresh start, and now a party in my name. I ran a thumb along the card's gilded edge. It was beautiful, deliberately so, the kind of bespoke design that spoke of money and meticulous planning. I could picture Beatrice at a boutique print shop in Boston, deliberating over paperweights and ink colors. She always had a flawless eye for aesthetics and a chilling knack for timing. The event was scheduled for the following Saturday at Julian's new estate in Port Blossom, the one with the cavernous open-concept kitchen and a sprawling backyard manicured for catered affairs. Cold knot tightened in my chest as I set the card down beside my uneaten toast. What does one do when their own children, silent for years, suddenly reappear in calligraphy? They hadn't visited after my hip surgery. I'd taken a car service to the hospital alone when the ancient boiler gave out last winter. I'd paid for its replacement from the dwindling annuity Arthur had left me, and now they wished to honor me. I stood and walked to the built-in cabinet beneath the portrait of my husband. It still smelled faintly of cedar and his old pipe tobacco tucked at the very back behind stacks of linen. Napkins was a small Polaroid from a lifetime ago. It was Arthur and I standing in our first garden, my hands caked with soil. He was leaning over, his smile impossibly young, brushing a smudge of dirt from my cheek. He used to say I wasn't just the heart of the family, I was the architect of its foundation. The unseen blueprint that made everything stand. That faded photograph was a stark reminder that I was not always invisible. I glanced at the invitation one last time. I could have thrown it in the fire. I could have stayed home, cocooned in my quiet dignity, and let them perform their pageant without its silent guest of honor, but I didn't. Something about the flawless perfection of that card felt deeply wrong. A surface too smooth, a narrative too polished. It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Miss Agnes Petrova answered, her voice still carrying the warm, no-nonsense tone of her Eastern European roots. She worked as an independent consultant now, but for a decade she'd been the head of logistics at a prestigious event planning firm that Beatrice frequently used for her corporate galas. There was a long, thoughtful pause on the other end after I explained. Then Agnes said something that made the knot in my chest turn to ice. Alara, they booked that venue 3 months ago, but your name was never part of the plan. Not until last week I hung up the phone. The receiver feeling unnervingly heavy. It was never about honoring me, it was about staging. But I would go, I would wear my best pearls and a serene smile. I would not go to be honored. I would go to witness precisely what they were trying to build atop my grave, and perhaps, just perhaps, to remind them that Alara Vance was the architect of this family and was not yet ready to be condemned to the footnotes. I arrived at Julian's estate 5 minutes early. The long, winding driveway was already choked with imported cars. A valet, a boy with the bored expression of a professional, waved me toward a space on the curb, as if I were a curious neighbor who had wandered over by mistake. The house was aglow, wrapped in golden string lights that dripped from the eaves and coiled around the sculpted hedges in the vast backyard. Tables, draped in crisp white linen, stood like silent sentinels, each adorned with crystal glassware and towering centerpieces of cream-colored hydrangeas. There was no sign bearing my name, no designated seat of honor. Another young server, barely out of his teens, pointed me toward a small solitary table near the sliding glass doors to the kitchen. It was tucked unceremoniously behind a large potted ficus tree. A living screen wobbled precariously. When I sat, there was no place card, no glass of water. From my obstructed vantage point I could hear the clatter of trays and the hushed, urgent whispers of the kitchen staff. I pulled my cashmere shawl tighter around my shoulders. The late spring air was warm, but a palpable chill emanated from my forgotten corner. My daughter Genevieve was the first I saw. She moved through the perfectly manicured lawn like a wraith, a glass of pale Chardonnay in her hand, laughing at something Beatrice whispered in her ear. Her dress, a column of shimmering silver, caught the fairy lights with every fluid movement when her gaze finally found me half hidden behind the ficus. Her smile didn't falter, but it didn't reach her eyes. She offered a nod so slight it was almost an illusion, then looked away. Her expression, one of mild annoyance, as if my presence were a logistical snag she had to tolerate, rather than a reunion. She welcomed Beatrice, stood near the French doors holding a small stack of note cards. Her posture as sharp and impeccable as her makeup. She tapped a spoon against a champagne flute, the delicate chime cutting through the murmur of conversation. "We gather tonight," began her voice, smooth as silk, "to mark the next chapter, not just of our family's legacy, but of how we define purpose, community, and stewardship for generations to come." Her eyes swept across the crowd of investors, local dignitaries, and socialites. She never once looked at me behind her. Julian adjusted his tie and stepped forward. "Tonight isn't just about gratitude," he said, his voice lacking its usual warmth. "It's about vision, about structure, about securing the future of what our family has built." I felt it then. It wasn't grief or anger, it was something far stranger, a profound and surreal dislocation, like being the guest of honor at your own retirement party only. No one had bothered to tell you that you'd been fired. Genevieve had drifted behind the speakers, close enough to be part of the tableau, but detached enough not to be involved in the speeches. She sipped her wine slowly, her eyes dark and intelligent, darting between the faces in the crowd, assessing, calculating. Then Julian smiled, a strained public-facing gesture, and motioned toward a small table set apart from the others. On it rested a large, imposing folder bound in dark leather with gold lettering on the front. A notary stood beside it, a clipboard held rigidly in his hands. No one said my name, but I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that the folder concerned me. They were parading it like a trophy. Someone in the crowd began to clap. Beatrice took a slight bow as if she were the host of a triumphant charity gala. Genevieve raised her glass in a silent toast. To Julian. I rose from my wobbly chair. No one noticed. I walked to the edge of the gathering, positioning myself just behind the last row of guests, close enough to hear their final devastating act. Beatrice glanced at the notary, then announced, "We're ready to formalize the transition." The timing couldn't be more perfect. Genevieve turned her head just slightly, and her lips curled at the corner. Not quite a smile, something smaller, quieter and infinitely more cruel than Julian said. The words that sealed it all. "We need is one more signature." The notary turned, his eyes searching the crowd before they landed on me. I didn't move. Genevieve's heels clicked on the stone patio as she approached me. She leaned in, her perfume cloying and sweet. Her voice was a gentle whisper, a parody of daughterly affection. "This is just a formality, Mother, just so we can all move ahead." And then, as I stood there frozen in disbelief, she lifted her hand and slapped me across the face. It wasn't a blow of passion or rage. It was not loud, it was methodical. A deliberate dismissive gesture, meant to humiliate and assert dominance. Beatrice let out a short, sharp breath, and Julian, son, clapped once slowly. A single solitary sound that served as punctuation to their betrayal. No one spoke. No one gasped. And I did not cry, because this was not a surprise. This was a reveal. And in my heart I had been preparing for it all along. The room fell unnervingly still after the crack of Genevieve's hand against my skin. The string quartet continued to play somewhere in the garden. A lilting melody from another world. Another party. My face stung, but not from pain. It stung with a horrifying clarity. The young notary stepped forward, clearing his throat. He was perhaps Julian's age, with eyes that refused to meet mine. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. He gestured with a pen. "The documents are ready for your signature. Initial here and here." He didn't look at me, as an elder, as the matriarch this party was supposedly honoring. He looked at me as if I were the final convenient item on a long checklist. I glanced down at the leather-bound folder. The gold letters gleamed under the patio lights. Vance Family Estate. Reallocation. I opened it, page after page of dense legal type, indexed and tabbed with sections. Highlighted in yellow, witness signatures were already in place. Only one line remained empty. My name printed in bold beneath it. This hadn't been a spontaneous act. This had been drafted, reviewed by lawyers, notarized in advance. They had completed my erasure long before they ever looked me in the eye. Julian's voice cut through the silence, smooth. "But this just clarifies the trust structure. Mother, it keeps things clean. For the next phase of the company, it's not personal." I looked up at him. My son, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged. He couldn't hold my gaze for more than a heartbeat before his eyes darted away. Beatrice crossed her arms, patience wearing thin. "If you're going to cause a scene, Alara, do it quickly. We have investors here." Genevieve said nothing. She didn't need to. She simply leaned against a stone pillar, one hip cocked, her fingers tracing the edge of a diamond bracelet I'd never seen before. White gold, no doubt purchased from the same family fund they were now systematically pushing me out of. I looked back at the page, my thumb resting over the signature line, but I did not lift the pen. I slid the heavy folder closed with a quiet thud. "I won't be signing anything tonight," I said, my voice even and clear. There was a pause, not a gasp, not a shout, just a thick, expectant silence. As they recalibrated, Beatrice scoffed. "You're being dramatic." That's when my daughter reached for my arm again, her grip surprisingly strong. I stepped back, and from the corner of the garden, Julian clapped. That same single slow clap, it echoed, far too loud for such a small gesture. A grotesque parody of applause, and Beatrice, my polished daughter-in-law, smirked. That tiny curl of the lip I'd seen earlier, was now a full satisfied crescent. What stayed with me wasn't the sting of the slap, or the hollow sound of the clap. It was the look in Beatrice's eyes. She knew she had anticipated this moment, perhaps even orchestrated it with Genevieve, and she didn't care that I saw her satisfaction. I stepped away from the table. The notary, looking immensely relieved, quickly gathered his clipboard and stamp, melting back into the crowd. Julian didn't stop me. Neither did Beatrice. Genevieve raised her glass and whispered something to a man beside her, who chuckled. I didn't wait to hear the punchline. As I walked past the beautifully dressed guests, their chatter and laughter resumed instantly, as if I had merely played a brief scripted role and was now being dismissed from the stage. Disposable. I reached the driveway without another word exchanged. My car was still parked at the curb, an island of familiar metal and glass. The valet didn't offer to open my door inside. I sat with my hands gripping the steering wheel, my pulse finally steady, stared ahead at the glowing lights of the house. A beautiful facade, hiding a rotten core. I had helped Arthur draft the business plan that started his architectural firm. I had personally balanced the books for the first 5 years. I'd paid for Genevieve's elite boarding school when the firm was still struggling, and still they had tried to write me out with a signature. But I was not the kind of woman who left her own story empty-handed. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked straight to the hall closet, pulled out the small stepladder and reached to the highest shelf past the heavy windows and boxes of old photographs there. Wrapped in a linen dust bag was the box, small, wooden, heavy for its size. The brass lock clicked open with a key I wore on a chain around my neck, a key my children didn't know existed. I carried it to the kitchen table and placed it down my hand, hovered over the lid. I already knew what was inside: the original unaltered copy of Arthur's will, and something far more powerful, a small USB drive, and on it, my husband's voice waiting patiently to speak the truth. I drove home in a profound silence, my hands gripping the wheel as if it were the only solid thing. In a dissolving world at a red light, I caught my own reflection in the rear-view mirror. A faint red mark bloomed on my cheek, a brand from Genevieve's hand. But that wasn't what stung it. It was the applause. Julian's casual dismissive clap and Beatrice's smug silent complicity, pulling into my driveway. The headlights cut a sharp swath across the familiar facade of my home. It felt colder, hollowed out inside my heels, clicked an unnervingly loud rhythm against the hardwood floors. Everything looked the same, but the very air had changed. I poured a glass of water, my hand steady, and sat at the kitchen table staring into the darkness. Then I walked to the old secretary desk in the study. I hadn't opened the bottom locked drawer in 3 years. Inside was the small dark wood box secured with the brass key that rested against my skin. My fingers trembled as I undid the chain, not from fear but from deeper emotion, restraint, perhaps, or memory preparing to be weaponized. I opened the box. There it lay, the thick cream-colored envelope containing the original copy of Arthur's last will and testament, untouched. I pulled it out. The paper yellowed slightly at the edges, but the ink was as dark and clear as the day it was signed. Every line was a familiar comfort, every word a testament to the man who saw me, who truly saw me as his equal and partner. Then I reached deeper into the box and retrieved the small silver USB drive, the one Arthur had pressed into my palm just days before he passed away. Own hand surprisingly firm, despite the weakness that had taken hold of his voice. He had whispered his words, not born of fear but of a grim foresight. Alara, if they ever try to erase you, let them hear this. I walked over to the old laptop in the den, a sturdy, outdated model we never replaced. Arthur claimed it was reliable. I slid the USB into the port. A single audio file appeared on the screen. I clicked it. His voice filled the silent room. Steady, calm, deliberate. My name is Arthur Vance. This recording is for whoever needs to understand my final wishes. My wife Alara was not just my partner in life, she was my partner in creation. Every blueprint, every deal, every sacrifice, she was the silent architect of it all. I have ensured my will reflects this unbreakable truth. If anyone for any reason attempts to alter it, they are not merely dishonoring my memory,
They are attempting to build a legacy on a foundation of lies. Do not let them write over the story. We live together. I sat frozen, the voice I hadn't heard in years, enveloping me. It didn't break me. It braced me. I closed the laptop, my hands no longer trembling. I walked back to the kitchen, poured the untouched water down the drain, and stood in the quiet darkness. I was not going to fight them with screams or pleas. I was going to hold my ground with the unassailable weight of the truth. I opened the desk drawer again and pulled out a small leather-bound address book. I wrote down 3 names and their numbers. Then I closed the box, locked it, and put the key back around my neck before going to bed. I placed Arthur's will and the USB drive into a new plain manila folder and slid it beneath a loose floorboard in the guest room closet just in case. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in years. I slept through the night, not because the pain was gone, but because I finally remembered who I was, and I knew with absolute certainty that Arthur never forgot the next morning. I awoke before the sun, the house steeped in a purposeful quiet. I made a cup of strong black tea and sat by the window, letting the pale dawn light warm my face. My mind was a placid lake, but beneath the surface a powerful current was moving by 8 a.m. I was dialing the first number, Mr. Sterling. It had been years, but when he answered, his voice was the same, a low, reassuring rumble like stones settling into place. He didn't ask why I was calling. After so long, he simply said, "Alara, I've been waiting for this call." I told him everything. The party that was a stage, the contract that was a weapon, the slap that was a declaration, and the recording that was my shield. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he asked only for the documents, promised to have them couriered to his Boston office by the next day. Before we hung up, his voice softened. "Arthur always knew this might happen. Alara, he made sure you would have exactly what you needed when the time came." Later that morning, I made my second call. Miss Agnes Petrova answered on third ring, her voice carrying its familiar weary warmth. She was once a dear friend, before Beatrice arrived and turned every family gathering into a silent, ruthless competition of status and utility. Agnes had been the heart of the charitable foundation. Arthur and I had built the quiet compassion force, who remembered employees' birthdays and showed up with homemade soup when their worlds fell apart. But until one day, she was simply gone. No farewell party, no explanation. I asked if she remembered why she left. She let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Because your daughter-in-law said I didn't bring enough strategic value to the team, that I was dead weight," she said it to my face while wearing a cashmere coat. "I knew for a fact you had given her." Agnes didn't ask why I was calling either. She simply asked when I would like to meet. We settled on that afternoon. She offered to bring scones for the first time in days. I smiled. The third and final call was the most difficult, not because I didn't trust the person on the other end, but because she was the last thread connecting me to the days before the foundation of my life began to crack. Her name was Clara, a senior administrative officer at local credit union, where Arthur had established our family trust decades ago. When she answered, her voice was a mix of surprise and genuine warmth. I explained that I needed help reviewing recent activity on a few family accounts. I was careful with my words, assuring her I wasn't asking for anything illicit, only that I had reason to believe my name or
092 and hung up. My tea had gone cold, but I didn't notice the past 3 years had taught me that silence serves only to protect the wrong people. I had been quiet for far too long now. Every conversation felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. That afternoon, Agnes arrived with warm lemon scones and a printout of the foundation's board roster from 5 years ago. The year she was forced out, we sat in the living room, and for 2 hours we talked about Arthur, about the old days, about the quiet, unseen women who do all the work, but never see their names on the letterhead. When she left, she hugged me, a fierce, protective embrace. "You still have fight in you, Alara," she whispered. "That's more than most people ever get back by the end of the day." I had my allies, one who knew the law, one who knew the players, and one who knew where the money trail began. and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I was not going to be erased without leaving my own indelible mark. When spent the next morning at my dining room table, the documents spread out before me like pieces of a shattered mosaic. My fingers traced the lines of Arthur's will, the signatures on old bank forms, transfer records. Clara had discreetly emailed. I moved slowly, methodically, my mind sharper than it had been in years. I started with the trust account. Agnes had flagged a few suspicious dates, which helped narrow the search. I pulled the quarterly statements and focused on a series of wire transfers coded as consulting fees. One in particular caught my eye, a payment of $28,000 made to an entity called GVC Strategies, an LLC registered just weeks before the payment was issued. I didn't need a lawyer to decipher my daughter's initials, Genevieve Vance. I printed the statement and circled the transaction in red ink. Next, I moved to the Family Foundation's expense reports. Beatrice had organized a Women in Leadership Wellness retreat the previous spring. I vaguely recalled receiving a generic e-blast about it, but never a personal call, never an actual invitation. The retreat had taken place at a luxury spa in the Berkshires. I dug deeper into the files Agnes had provided, and there it was, $42,000 paid to Havenwood Springs Spa, listed under the Foundation's community outreach budget, except as Agnes had confirmed with a forwarded link to a private online photo album. The retreat wasn't for community, it was an invite-only affair for Beatrice's social circle and a few hand-picked media influencers. The photos showed Beatrice smiling in a plush white robe, clinking champagne glasses with her friends, a banner in the background reading "Rooted in Renewal." I pinned the spa invoice beneath. The GVC Strategies transfer. The final folder contained Arthur's personal archives. His handwriting, tidy and intentional, felt like a message from beyond. I found a letter tucked inside a file marked Legacy Notes. It contained handwritten thoughts on board members, donation strategies, and estate planning. One line scrawled in the margin made my breath catch. Record of conflict. GV raises concern over AP's value to team. Urges termination. No performance issue. Noted. There it was, a paper trail leading back to the very beginning of the rot. By noon, I had assembled my case. I labeled 3 separate folders: Trust, Unauthorized Payments, Foundation, Misuse of Funds, and Conflict Notes. Staff removal. I scanned every document onto a secure drive Mr. Sterling had set up for me, instructing me to hold on to the physical copies and store them off-site. That afternoon, Clara from the credit union called back. Her voice was careful, measured. She confirmed that Genevieve had recently attempted to update the trustee contact information, replacing my name with Julian's on 2 key accounts. The request, she said, had been submitted electronically with a scanned letter of authorization supposedly signed by me. Paused. Alara, the signature doesn't match any of your other forms on file. I've flagged the request for now, but you should know, Julian is already acting as if it's been approved. I thanked her, a cold resolve settling over me. The pieces all fit. They were constructing an entirely new narrative, one without me in it. Confident that I was too slow to keep up, too sentimental to fight back. But I wasn't fighting for revenge, I was fighting to restore the truth to its rightful place. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, I had 3 folders of evidence, 2 digital backups, 1 locked briefcase, a clear timeline. In 1 week, Mr. Sterling would begin sending letters, but first I had one final step. I needed a witness to my own actions. I called Sharon, a notary public, who had known Arthur since his early days on the town council. I asked her to come by. She didn't ask why, she simply said she would bring her stamp and be there before dinner that evening. As she pressed her official seal onto the affidavit confirming the contents and authenticity of my documents, I felt something settle deep inside me. Not peace, not yet, but steadiness. I was no longer adrift. I was an anchor. The morning sun had yet cleared the horizon when Mr. Sterling arrived. He looked older than I remembered, his silver-handled cane tapping a soft rhythmic beat. on the slate tiles of my foyer. He stepped into the kitchen as if no time had passed since the days he used to consult with Arthur over coffee exchanged. No pleasantries. He simply nodded, opened his worn leather briefcase and began laying out the strategy we had quietly forged over the phone. 3 letters. That's what he called them. Not legal notices, not demands, just 3 simple letters, but they carried the weight to crumble stone walls built on a foundation of lies. The first was addressed to my son Julian. It clinically outlined the potential criminal liability of presenting a forged financial document to a federally insured institution. Mr. Sterling had traced the funds, Genevieve funneled from the family trust under the guise of GVC strategies. There were invoices, there were dates. Genevieve's name was on the LLC registration. Julian's digital signature captured from the bank's security logs was on the authorization. The second letter went to Beatrice. It was more surgical. Mr. Sterling had identified multiple instances where the family foundation account was used to pay vendors directly affiliated with her private spa events. One name stood out: Azure Bloom Wellness, a luxury retreat in Napa Valley. I remembered the glossy brochure left on her coffee table last year. Mr. Sterling had attached a precise timeline of withdrawals from the foundation, perfectly matched with the event dates, proving a clear misuse of charitable funds for personal gain. The third letter, however, was the most potent. It contained a certified copy of Arthur's original unaltered will and a transcript of the audio file from the USB drive. His voice now immortalized on paper. Mr. Sterling attached a sworn affidavit from me, attested by Sharon's notary seal. This letter was not sent to my children. It was sent directly to the head of wealth management at our family's bank, and to the regional office of the state's estate authority. The letter was not a warning. It was a preemptive strike. I did not deliver the letters myself. That would have made it personal. A family squabble. This was business. Mr. Sterling made a call to a woman at the bank, someone who had once worked under Arthur and still spoke of him with a quiet reverence, agreed to place the sealed envelopes into the correct hands without delay, without drama. That afternoon I sat in my garden while Mr. Sterling drafted the final supporting documents on his laptop. The air was fragrant with rosemary and damp earth. The stillness was heavy, but it was the stillness of anticipation, not despair. For the first time in 3 long years, I felt as if I wasn't the one scrambling to catch up. I looked over at the small wooden box on the patio table, the same one I had unlocked just days ago. Now it held only copies, photos, timelines, and bank statements. The truth was no longer a secret hidden in my house. It was printed, stapled, notarized, and sealed inside official envelopes, making its way through the city's arteries of power before leaving. Mr. Sterling paused at the door. He looked at me not as a lawyer looking at a client, but as a man who had watched my family attempt to perform the quietest, cruelest kind of murder. "You're doing this with dignity, Alara," he said. "They won't see it coming because they never truly saw you to begin with." I didn't reply as the sun dipped lower. I lit a single candle on the kitchen counter. It was a habit from my life with Arthur. Used to say it gave the room a sense of peace before an important event. Tomorrow the letters would land. Genevieve's calculated composure would crack. Julian's inherited entitlement would falter, and Beatrice's carefully curated world would begin to show its seams. The call started less than after the letters were delivered. The first was from Julian. His voice was clipped, unnaturally calm. He spoke in circles, asking if I'd heard from Mr. Sterling, if I'd seen some strange correspondence. I remained silent. Then his composure broke. "Genevieve told me about a letter," he stammered. "Not just 3. And the bank. They've frozen access to our joint account." He tried to muster anger, but all I could hear beneath it was the thin, high whine of fear before I could speak. He pivoted, his words tumbling out. "Genevieve always handled the finances. I never looked too closely. Her judgment, it's been off lately. Maybe it was Beatrice's idea. I don't know." He was already building his lifeboat, ready to abandon the ship. He helped steer toward the rocks. I didn't respond. I just listened. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to manage his emotions or soothe his anxieties. When I hung up, the phone immediately rang again.
Genevieve, her tone was pure ice. Are you really doing this? Are you prepared to drag our family name through the mud over a misunderstanding? She called Mr. Sterling a relic and accused me of staging a coup. I said nothing. My silence seemed to unnerve her more than any argument could. Her tone shifted, becoming softer, conspiratorial. We can fix this. Mother, I can make this right. Just tell me what you want. Still, I said nothing, and then she snapped. If you go forward with this, I will make sure everyone remembers your family's past. I'll drag your parents' names into it, their debts, their shame. I know people who still remember. I took a slow, steadying breath. I remember them too, Genevieve, I said quietly, and hung up the phone. It wasn't a power play. It was a statement of fact. The third contact was not a call but a voicemail from Beatrice. She didn't even attempt denial. She begged. She sobbed. She said her primary investors had pulled out of her spa expansion deal, that the bank had flagged inheritance issues with her startup capital. Then she said something that lingered long after the tears and threats. I never wanted to cut you out, Alara. I just thought it would be easier for everyone if the story simply ended with you there. It was the quiet violence of their intentions wrapped in the polished language of convenience. Easier if the story ended not a lie precisely, but a truth so twisted it had become monstrous. That evening, I lit another candle, not for comfort but for remembrance. Years ago, Arthur had told me, never let their silence make you feel erased, Alara. Use it. I sat at the kitchen table and reread his will, his familiar signature, the notes in the margin, and the final paragraph, which now read like a prophecy to my wife. Alara, who held this family quietly together, even when we forgot she was the glue. He had written, forgot, not ignored, not dismissed, forgot. There is a profound difference. They had forgotten who held the blueprint, and I had finally remembered. I didn't call anyone else that night. I didn't have to. My silence was now doing all the work. Julian would turn on Genevieve. Genevieve would claw at Beatrice. Beatrice would play the victim. The web they had so carefully woven was now entangling them. By morning, their stories would fall apart. Not because I tore them down, but because I refused to be the final tragic chapter. There are moments
when a person reclaims their life, not with a shout but with a whisper of truth, that brings an entire house of cards down. That night, I reclaimed my name, and the next morning, I would show them that remembering is always more powerful than rewriting. The meeting was set for 10. Conference room at Mr. Sterling's downtown office. There were no gilded patios, no string quartets, no family banners, just one long mahogany table, its edges worn from decades of disputes, and 4 chairs waiting for 3 grown children, and the mother they had tried to silence. I arrived first, wearing the same simple navy blue coat I had worn to their father's funeral. It was not for drama, but for memory. Beatrice came next. She didn't greet me. She looked pale and diminished, as if the sharp edges of her ambition had been sanded down by fear. Julian followed, his suit still impeccably crisp. Tension in his jaw betrayed a man who was no longer in control. Genevieve was last. She still wore her high heels and flawless makeup, but her eyes, usually so steady and assessing, darted around the room. She was not accustomed to spaces. She could not dominate. Mr. Sterling walked in, placed 3 identical manila folders on the table, and gave me a slight nod. I stood up. This isn't a negotiation, I said, my voice calm and clear. In the quiet room, this is a correction. No one moved. Your father's will remains unchanged. I continued. As you are all now aware, it was never revised, never reassigned. It stands, as does the evidence that some of you attempted to rewrite it without legal or moral authority. Genevieve shifted in her seat. Julian lowered his head, staring at his clasped hands. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. But I'm not keeping it. That got their attention. I watched eyes flicker with a new desperate calculation. I am placing the entirety of the estate into a new foundation. I announced, a trust, not one built on control or legacy, but on purpose. It will be a resource network, a scholarship fund for women who, like me, were made to feel invisible inside their own homes, their contributions erased by those they loved most.
I opened a small leather portfolio and slid the first page of the charter across the table. The name of the fund is the Endowment for the Unseen. Their faces were masks of disbelief. Your father once told me I was the glue that held this family together. And then you forgot. But forgetting does not erase it, only delays the inevitable return of the truth. Julian exhaled sharply. Genevieve's jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle jumped in her cheek. Beatrice whispered almost to herself. Why would you do this? I didn't answer her. The papers in front of them spoke, far more loudly than I ever could. They would no longer inherit a fortune through assumption and forgery. They would no longer speak for me with polished lies and altered documents. That era was over. Mr. Sterling handed each of them a copy of the Foundation's legal structure. Everything transparent, nothing hidden. The Foundation would be launched within the month. The assets that once held our family together would now help other women rebuild their lives after being cast aside. Genevieve tried to speak something about legacy, about bloodlines. I held up my hand, a simple gesture that silenced her. Legacy, Genevieve, is what you leave in truth, not what you snatch in secret. I gathered my coat. The room was still. The silence was not awkward. It was heavy and deeply deserved. I looked at each of them one last time. My son, my daughter-in-law, strangers at my table. And then, I walked out that morning. I didn't just reclaim my legal standing. I reclaimed my meaning. I rewrote the definition of my own motherhood, not as the woman who gives endlessly until she is empty, but as the woman who protects what is true, even from her own children. And as I stepped out into cold, bright morning light, the only thing I carried with me was peace.